Okay, in this lecture I'm going to talk about first the esophagus and then the stomach. The esophagus really only has one job, and that is to rapidly push food from the pharynx down to the stomach. And by rapidly, I mean about 3 seconds. So the esophagus acts very quickly to press swallowed bolus from the mouth down into the stomach. It does it by a means of muscle contraction called peristalsis. And that food is going to pass down through the esophagus through a hole in the diaphragm called the esophageal hiatus, and then down through a sphincter called the cardiac sphincter or esophageal sphincter or cardioesophageal sphincter. All of those are different names for the same sphincter, which separates the esophagus from the stomach. That's an important sphincter because if it's not functioning properly, acids from the stomach can splash up into the esophagus, leading to reflux or heartburn, such as the case with GERD. All right, so let's get into the stomach itself. The stomach does do some mechanical or physical digestion by churning, so the smooth muscle in the wall of the stomach can help to break up food. The stomach also adds a lot of liquid to food, so in the stomach food gets much more liquefied, and we call it chyme instead of bolus, and chyme is simply juicier or more liquid than bolus. We also start to do some chemical digestion of proteins in the stomach. Within the stomach you've got a enzyme called pepsin. That's the activated form of the enzyme, and pepsin can act on proteins to start to break them down into their amino acid components. The stomach itself does not do much in the way of nutrient absorption. However, you do absorb excess water in the stomach. So you'll notice if you drink a massive 32 ouncer of soda or something, you'll note that you need to urinate about an hour later, and that's because much of that excess water was absorbed right into your stomach, from your stomach into the blood, and then your kidneys then filtered it out, and that's where that excess urine production came from. You can also absorb some medications in the stomach, such as aspirin. Many medications are coded to prevent stomach upset, which prevents them from being absorbed in the stomach, and you end up absorbing those medications in the small intestine instead. And then some drugs that are lipid soluble can be absorbed right in the stomach. But other than that, the stomach doesn't do much in the way of nutrient absorption at all. So for the basic anatomy of the stomach, you learned in lab that the cardiac region is the area near the esophagus, the fundus or fundic region is the uppermost portion of the stomach, and the pyloric region is the area closest to the duodenum. The rest of the stomach is called the body, and if you look at this diagram, you'll notice in the wall of the stomach you have not 2 but 3 layers of muscle. You have the usual longitudinal and circular layers, but you also have an additional layer that's at an angle called the oblique layer. So the muscularis layer in the GI tract wall of the stomach has 1 extra layer of muscle. Look at the lining of the stomach. You'll notice it's got a lot of folds and contours called rugae. Essentially think of the stomach as a collapsed sac that can expand and fill a great deal. Quite a bit of capacity in the stomach. All right, if we look closely at the wall of the stomach, we'll find the mucus in the wall of the stomach contains a lot of pits called gastric pits or gastric glands. I'm going to talk more specifically about some of the cells lining those pits in just a minute. And I already mentioned that the muscularis of the stomach wall has 3 layers rather than 2. Okay, so if we were to look at one gastric pit and gland, we would find lining that deep pit a variety of cells. So I'm going to go through some of those types of cells. You've got what are called goblet cells because they look like wine glasses or goblets, and they produce an alkaline mucus. It's important that the lining of the stomach be basic because, of course, the fluids in the stomach are highly acidic, and the second those acidic fluids touch the lining of the stomach, they're neutralized by the alkaline mucus, which is good because that means the acids won't burn through the wall of your stomach. Now, if you have a pH imbalance in the stomach, like that due to, say, an infection with a bacterial organism called H. pylori, that pH imbalance could lead to ulcers. So we've now understood that most ulcers are not in fact caused directly by stress, but actually by a bacterial infection messing with the pH balance of the lining of the stomach. You also find in the wall of these pits regenerative cells, and those regenerative cells, as their name suggests, do mitosis. Even with the alkaline mucus protecting the lining of the stomach, those cells are going to ultimately be degraded by the acids in the stomach, and so we need to be able to make new lining. So we need mitotic regenerative cells to help us create new stomach lining cells. Deep within the gastric glands, which are deep underneath the pits, you find parietal cells, and those cells make hydrochloric acid and an important chemical called intrinsic factor that I'll talk about a bit later. The hydrochloric acid is important because it activates the digestive enzyme in the stomach called pepsin. You also find cells called chief cells. They make an inactive enzyme called pepsinogen. When pepsinogen is released, it can be activated by hydrochloric acid to take on its active form called pepsin, which is an enzyme that breaks down proteins. You also find some endocrine cells, also called G cells, or enteroendocrine cells, that, as the name endocrine suggests, produce hormones, the primary one being gastrin, and that the gastrin can then regulate the processes of all the other cells that I've mentioned, especially the regulation of pH. Okay, so I alluded to it a minute ago, but the function of hydrochloric acid is to activate a chemical called pepsinogen into an active form called pepsin. Pepsinogen is an inactive enzyme. Pepsin is the active form. Pepsin will only take on its proper shape or active form when it's in a pH of 2 to 4. So that's where hydrochloric acid comes into play. Most of the pH levels in your body that are so highly regulated are the purpose of maintaining those pH levels is to make sure that enzymes remain activated. In much of your body, enzymes require a pH near neutral, but in this case, in the stomach, pepsin only takes on its proper active form when it's in a highly acidic environment of 2 to 4. Another function of the acid, of hydrochloric acid, is it can break up some of the connective tissues in especially plant cells, cell walls. So it does kind of do a direct form of chemical digestion, or mechanical, I suppose. And then another function of the hydrochloric acid is it can take the iron that you ingest in your diet and convert it into a form that you can absorb into your blood. And finally, a very important function of hydrochloric acid is many microorganisms can't survive that acidic pH and are killed right there in the stomach before they might be allowed to infect other parts of the body. I mentioned earlier that intrinsic factor is produced by some of the cells in the walls of your gastric glands, specifically the parietal cells. And intrinsic factor is a chemical that allows you to absorb a vitamin called B12. And B12 is a vitamin that you have a very hard time absorbing otherwise. So without the intrinsic factor, the B12 in your diet would just end up in your feces. It would never get absorbed. B12 is needed for a whole variety of functions in your body, including the production of red blood cells, the functioning of neurons, and memory, which is a byproduct of the functioning of neurons, and also the production of DNA. If you look at this artist illustration, look inside the stomach, the purple triangles would represent B12 coming in through the diet, and the blue squares would represent intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor is able to latch on to B12 and then allow B12 to be absorbed into the lining of the GI tract. Pepsin, keep in mind, is the active form of pepsinogen. It is activated by hydrochloric acid, and the mechanism here is something called positive feedback. So once you get a little bit of pepsin activated by hydrochloric acid, that little bit of pepsin that's activated will go ahead and activate more pepsinogen, so you get more pepsin, and you keep getting more and more, and that allows you to digest proteins that might be in the stomach.